Emily was like any other teenage girl, quiet, polite, with a first-class ticket in hand, a ticket that was not only a confirmation of a luxurious journey, but also a milestone for her efforts to reach a bright future. It was the first time she had a flight away from home, leaving the embrace of her family, a move full of hope and pride. But not all that she hoped to await came with the light of glory. Instead, it only brings humiliation. Sitting by the window, dressed casually in a light gray hoodie and jeans, Emily didn't stand out, didn't need to. She knew she'd earned this ticket through her own efforts, an arduous journey of stressful exams and late-night studying. But the moment Claire, the head stewardess with platinum blonde hair and piercing eyes, looked right through Emily, everything changed. Claire didn't see a hopeful young woman, but an intruder unworthy of first-class luxury. And in that gaze, there was not just judgment, but contempt, as if Emily were just a girl out of place. The feeling immediately spread throughout the cabin, making the atmosphere not only tense but also strange. The surrounding eyes, though silent, were still full of observation, and whispers like small waves lapped everywhere. Emily couldn't help but feel out of place on the very flight she should have been proud of. And that is just the beginning. Emily sat quietly by the window, clutching her plane ticket like it was a priceless possession. Although she was only 16 years old, this ticket was the mark of a proud journey. Her first flight without the protection of her family, the first time she had risen up on her own, opened the door to the world. But in her heart, that joy was mixed with a little anxiety. Maybe no one noticed that tension, but in this moment, Emily felt smaller than ever. She had tried so hard to study to get this seat. A seat in first class, a place where almost everyone had to work hard to set foot in. But that pride was overshadowed by a deep loneliness. For the first time leaving the protection of her parents, she was left alone with the question of whether she was really worthy. Lost in her thoughts, Emily didn't notice a figure approaching. Claire, a platinum blonde stewardess, stood in the aisle, her eyes cold and reflective of the perfection she allowed herself to carry. Claire was not an easy person to approach. She always had a cold, impassive demeanor, as if she had seen and judged everything before it happened. To Claire, everything had to follow a certain standard. No room for difference, no sympathy, only discipline. Today, she felt completely in control of every situation, even if it was just a young girl sitting in first class. "Are you sure you're sitting in the right seat?" Claire asked, her tone devoid of warmth, just a question heavy with challenge. Her eyes swept over Emily, stopping at the plane ticket she was still clutching in her hand. Emily felt her body tense up. She was not someone who got angry easily, but at that moment, Claire's words were like a nail stuck in her heart. She had worked hard to get this ticket, to prove that she was not a second-class passenger. However, Emily did not react. She remained calm, answering Claire calmly, "Yes, I am sure. My seat is 1A. However, deep down, a feeling of pain was in her heart. She did not understand why Claire had to be so suspicious. Claire didn't say anything more, but her eyes were still cold, as if she was examining every word on the ticket, as if she had never encountered a passenger like Emily, a girl with a plain, unpretentious appearance, not the type of customer Claire had ever served. In the quiet space of the first-class cabin, Claire's question and attitude made Emily feel even more like an outsider. All the other passengers' gazes seemed to turn away at the same time, creating a heavy silence. No one spoke up to protect her. Emily could only continue to sit there silently, gently raising her hand to hand the ticket to Claire. Even though in her heart, confusion and hurt were rising. Although she tried not to let Claire's attitude affect her, what happened in that moment made Emily realize that the confrontation between them would not be as easy as she thought. It felt like the entire space on the flight had suddenly closed in, surrounding Emily with a suffocating silence. In what she had thought would be a safe and relaxing space in first class, there was now an uncomfortable silence, invisible yet cold eyes following her every move. Emily still couldn't escape Claire's interrogating gaze. The pride in her academic achievements, the joy of being in first class seemed to have vanished, replaced by a sense of unfounded guilt. The kind that only someone like Claire could create in a 16-year-old girl. Claire stood there, her eyes never leaving Emily as if she was waiting for a rebuttal, an inappropriate move. But Emily remained silent, clutching the boarding pass, a part of her still unable to comprehend what had just happened. Claire seemed unwilling to let it go, and in a cold tone she continued. I think you misunderstood. This is a real first-class seat. You need to move to the back. It was not a casual statement, but a challenging command, as if all the decisions were in Claire's hands and people like Emily never had the right to set foot in this space. Claire's words were like a sharp knife cutting Emily's connection to this space. She had been proud of her efforts, of fighting against the odds to get this seat. But now, just because of how she looked at the world, because of where she came from, that respect was denied. Claire's order was like a sentence, affirming that Emily was not worthy enough to sit here. As Claire spoke, it wasn't just Emily who felt hurt, but all around her. The eyes of the other passengers followed, not in support, but in uncomfortable silence. Some of them turned away, avoiding her gaze, as if they didn't want to be involved in the situation. Some others looked at her with sympathy, but all of them were silent, no one daring to speak up to defend her. These eyes, though unspoken, were still witnesses. Witnesses of bystanders, witnesses of an act of discrimination that they didn't dare to face directly. They were like reluctant spectators, watching, but unable to change anything. Emily felt her heart constrict, but she couldn't cry, couldn't react. She knew there was nothing she could do but stay silent and accept this humiliation. She stood up silently, still holding the plane ticket tightly in her hand, her eyes looking down as if searching for a place to hide from the shame and humiliation. Every move felt like a stab in the heart, but she couldn't resist. She knew she didn't deserve to be treated like this, but she also knew that if she argued, things would only get worse. The passengers around her, though a little heartbroken, remained silent, not one person speaking up to defend her. The atmosphere was tense, only the rumble of the plane's engines a reminder of the indifference of those who witnessed the injustice. Emily moved to the back, where she knew she had to sit, not because she didn't deserve to be there, but because the silence and indifference of everyone else made her feel helpless. In the first-class cabin, which should have been a space of respect, now became a place of cold injustice. Both the passengers and the flight attendants turned away, leaving the 16-year-old girl alone and hurt, silently walking to the back, choked with emotion and speechless confusion. As Emily slowly walked back, her heart sank deeper into the abyss. The tension still hung in the air, creating an eerie silence. She sat down in the third-row seat, her heart empty. But then, in the cramped first-class cabin, a small, yet potentially life-changing change began to take place. A man in a navy suit stood up from his seat at the end of the row, his gaze fixed on Claire, but not with defiance or anger. It was steady, calm, and authoritative. The feeling of his presence changed the atmosphere. The passengers looked at each other, and gradually, they all realized one thing. This man was no ordinary passenger. He was not someone to be taken lightly, and he was clearly not someone who could tolerate the injustice Claire had just done to little Emily. The way he stood up, unhurried but resolute, was a silent signal. Anyone in the cabin, even someone who had just boarded the flight, could sense the difference in the way he moved, the way he approached the situation. The navy suit, the bright shirt, and the shiny leather shoes were more than just clothes. They were symbols of the power, the confidence, the influence that this man possessed. He didn't need to make any noise. His presence spoke for itself. Claire, the platinum blonde flight attendant, stood still with a cold expression, but her eyes were no longer as sharp as before. She felt something, a weight that she couldn't explain, from the man walking towards her. He was not in a hurry. Each step carried a decisiveness, as if time was not urgent for him. Everything was still happening slowly, but in that moment, there was clearly a change. The surrounding passengers who had witnessed Claire's cold treatment of Emily now turned to each other, their eyes no longer surprised or reserved. They realized that this was someone who could not be taken lightly. And his very presence, without a word, was like a hidden message. Things could not always go as they seemed. This man's eyes were not simply looking straight at Claire. They were opening a door to change, something that was about to happen. Claire, with all her usual cool confidence, now lowered her gaze, as if the presence of this man had shaken the space she had once controlled. Everyone in the compartment, whether they were observing or not, felt the change in the situation. And it was this man, not by shouting or criticizing, but just by appearing, that had created such a strong impact on everyone. Everything around seemed to be quiet. Just the appearance of this man, he had made all the eyes in the first-class cabin unable to help but pay attention. And like a chess game being rearranged, that man was preparing to change everything. As the last man in the Navy suit walked towards Claire, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin seemed to thicken, tense and heavy. The eyes of the passengers gradually turned towards them. No one dared to breathe loudly. No one wanted to break the silence that surrounded them, as if everything in the cabin was waiting for the next important moment. The quiet sighs, surprised and worried eyes of the passengers seemed to blend together, creating a space full of hidden meanings. The man in the suit stood firm, his steps light but carrying an undeniable weight. There was no hurry, but his eyes were locked on Claire, and there was an unshakable determination in them. He didn't need to say anything, because everything was said with his gaze, and his silence was strong enough to face the disrespect Claire showed her daughter. Claire, despite her cold and confident appearance that was hard to shake, could not help but feel the change in the atmosphere. She looked at the man for a moment, and an uneasy, uncomfortable feeling came over her. Despite his imposing presence, Claire kept her face calm, as if she was used to such tense situations. But in her eyes there was something sparkling, a sudden defensiveness. "Ma'am, I want you to explain to me why you're asking my daughter to move from here?" The man spoke, his voice low, steady, and cold. Not an outburst of anger, but an undeniable assertion. "Do you think my daughter doesn't deserve to be here? Do you think her presence here in first class is a mistake or an intrusion?" He continued, his eyes never leaving Claire, leaving her no room to back down or to argue. His question was not simply a reprimand, but a challenge, an invitation for Claire to reconsider her actions. Every word he spoke was an affirmation of respect, not just for his daughter, but for the fairness and kindness that every human being deserves. Claire, despite having seen many tense situations throughout her career, couldn't help but feel a lack of confidence in her words. She fell silent, no longer possessing the arrogance of someone in complete control of the situation. She looked at the man before her, and despite being trained to handle any difficult situation, in this moment, Claire began to realize that she wasn't just dealing with a father, but with someone whose values and mental strength were not easily shaken. At the same time, from afar, Emily sat still, watching. Even though she was there, far away from the conversation, her eyes never left her father. She felt his calmness, his steadfastness, and his strong protection for her. It felt like a protective layer was gradually surrounding her, making her heart less heavy, and a part of her felt relieved. This was a moment she had never experienced before. The feeling that she was not alone facing the world, but had a father by her side, ready to fight for what was right. Emily looked at her father, not just seeing a strong man, but a proud father, someone she could look up to and learn from. She realized that she was not an invisible girl in the eyes of this world, but a valuable person, worthy of respect. Even if it was just for a brief moment, it made her feel more stable, stronger. In the silence, the man's words, along with the attentive gazes of everyone around, seemed to have made it impossible for Claire to continue remaining indifferent. She stood there. No more excuses, just a long silence. And it seemed that in her heart, she also began to realize the mistake in her actions. The silence stretched like an invisible thread that wrapped around everyone in the cabin. Claire stood there, her hands hanging limply at her sides, her eyes no longer as cold as before. She felt the heat of the silence, the pressure inside her that she never thought she would have to face. Over the years of her career, Claire had learned to maintain her composure in any situation, but now she felt an uneasiness that she had never felt before. She turned away, trying not to let anyone see her hesitation, but inside, an undercurrent was rising, washing away all the false confidence she had built up. The man's words echoed in her head. Each sentence was an undeniable accusation, but also a wake-up call. "Do you think my daughter doesn't deserve to be here?" The question repeated itself, cutting off any excuses Claire had prepared. Claire knew that her actions, the discrimination she hadn't realized, had made her part of a system she had never considered. And now, facing the man, she couldn't ignore it, couldn't continue to hide the fact that she was the one who had been wrong. The feeling was strong, and in that moment, Claire felt like she was facing a painful truth. She remembered the times she had criticized, judged others because of hidden prejudices, invisible distinctions that she had not realized, but now they were right in front of her eyes. She asked herself, why do I think like that? Why do I allow myself to act like that? Those questions kept crashing down on her, like a wave washing away her self-righteous shell. The silence in the cabin was no longer one of waiting, but of unspoken emotion. Claire felt the eyes of everyone, not of criticism, but of expectation. And even the silent passengers began to look at her as a person, waiting for her to change. They didn't need her to do anything grand, but they wanted to see a sincere action, an acknowledgement that things weren't always as simple as she thought. Finally, after a long moment, Claire couldn't hide anymore. She turned to look at Emily, the young woman who was still sitting quietly in her seat. Emily's eyes, though still filled with doubt, also contained a hint of hope. And at that moment, Claire felt a strong urge within her, an urge she never thought she would need. She took a deep breath and stepped closer to Emily. "I'm sorry," Claire said, her voice soft but filled with a sincerity she never thought she could muster. "I am so sorry. I was wrong to judge you like that. There was no reason for me to treat you like that. You deserved respect, and I didn't give it to you. I will change." Those apologies, though brief, carried undeniable weight. And in that moment, Claire realized that change wasn't about grand gestures, but about admitting mistakes, about looking at yourself. She knew she couldn't change everything at once, but at least she had a start, with herself and with Emily. Emily looked at Claire, her eyes shining, not with immediate forgiveness, but with the recognition that sometimes change begins at crucial moments like this. She smiled softly, saying nothing, but a sense of relief gradually spread inside her, as if the whole world had just been lifted from an invisible burden. Finally, Claire turned away, her eyes shining, not with victory, but with openness. She knew she was no longer the same person, and in that cabin, in that moment, everything had changed. After that event, everything changed. The entire flight, and even the cabin, was no longer the same. In a space that seemed impossible to change, a gentle awakening began to creep in. Emily's father did not stop at solving the incident on the flight. He realized that this had to become a larger revolution, not just for the individual but for the whole system. Together with friends in the industry, he initiated a campaign for change within the airline company, setting up training sessions on fairness, on what every airline employee needs to understand. Respect and human rights are not optional, but an immutable requirement. The training sessions went beyond passenger behavior to self-awareness and how people can unintentionally inflict invisible wounds on others through seemingly harmless actions. They expanded the program, bringing fundamental change to the entire company's workforce, from flight attendants and pilots to check-in counter workers. And throughout the process, he worked tirelessly, not only to set an example for his daughter, but also for a society that he knew would be better off if every individual was seen and treated fairly. One morning, a few weeks after the incident, Emily received an envelope in the mail. Inside, she could not believe, was a letter from Claire, the stewardess she had thought she would never have the chance to face or change. The letter was short, but full of sincerity and courage. Claire had written a heartfelt apology, not only for her past actions, but also for the way she had viewed the world and other people. She wrote that she had realized her mistakes, and that apologizing was not a light act, but a powerful decision. Emily looked at the letter, her hands shaking a little. A conflicting feeling arose in her heart. Could she forgive the person who had hurt her? Was forgiveness just a weak gesture? Or was it really a way for her to free herself from the anger and hurt that Claire had caused? She felt the hesitation in her heart, but in the end, thinking about what had happened, she knew that forgiveness was the first step to change, not only for Claire, but also for herself. How could she ask the world to change if she couldn't start with the smallest things? She picked up a pen and wrote a reply, not too long, but full of emotion. "Thank you for having the courage to admit your mistakes. We can all change, and I hope that you will." Change certainly doesn't come overnight, but in that moment, Emily felt a quiet power within her. She knew that even a small act could create a big change. And in her mind, a thought began to sprout. Everyone can be a part of this quiet revolution. One small act, one right decision, can change an entire community. The story doesn't end with Claire apologizing or with a campaign for airline reform. It continues, not in a single explosive moment, but in the small changes each of us can make. And Emily, 16, continues her journey, but now she realizes that she is not alone in this life. She is part of something bigger, and the world, with its quiet revolutions, will never be the same again.